All right, we'll also move to this in the meantime. Now, a ruling is expected in the Ngizwe Mchunu's matter on whether the alleged July 2021 Unrest instigator has a case to answer to. The radio personality was arrested in connection with the unrest that gripped KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng, further sparked by the arrest of former President Jacob Zuma. Mchunu has pleaded not guilty to incitement charges, and today the Randburg Magistrates Court will decide whether the state has a prima facie case. And to discuss this even further, of course, I'm now joined by our reporter, eNCA's Heidi Giokos. Heidi, good morning to you, colleague. I think we're seeing Ngizwe again, post the July unrest and now back in court, but this time around to see if there's actually a prima facie case to answer to in this instance.
Yes, exactly, and I think that's critical in today's court proceedings. It's judgment on whether or not the state has a prima facie case against Ngizwe Mchunu, given the fact that he was arrested for allegedly inciting violence and violating the Disaster Management Act. One must remember that back in July 2021, when we saw that July unrest, the country was still under that Disaster Management Act. We do know that he had a lot of resistance and anger towards the arrest then of former President Jacob Zuma. He allegedly possibly incited some kind of violence linked to the July unrest. But that will all be determined today, whether or not the state was able to provide sufficient evidence before the court as to whether or not Mchunu was actually inciting violence and whether or not he did violate the Disaster Management Act. We do know that leading up to his arrest, he was supposed to have some sort of media address here in the city of Johannesburg. It later on moved to another location, but it's going to be critical to determine whether or not there is sufficient evidence, and the magistrate will, of course, have to determine that. If the magistrate does rule that the state does in fact have a prima facie case, that will mean that Mchunu will have to testify before the court today about what actually transpired in his version of events. He's maintained, Tumelo, time and time again, that this is all fabricated, that the state does not have a case, and this is why he's pleaded not guilty to the charges of inciting violence and violating the Disaster Management Act. We've seen support time and time again here outside the Randburg Magistrate Court. He has indicated that this has been an attack on him by the National Prosecuting Authority. He's even thrown jabs at Police Minister Ngizwe, indicating that there is no sufficient evidence to prove that he whatsoever incited any sort of violence. But that is, of course, for the court to decide, and that judgment is expected at around 11 o'clock this morning.
All right, we'll be sure to, of course, come back to you, colleague, as soon as there are any other latest updates regarding the court case. But we understand, of course, that's with regards to Ngizwe Mchunu, former radio presenter now appearing in court. This is where, of course, we understand there will be, of course, submissions to, rather, results to hear from the court if there is indeed a prima facie case for him to answer to. We've seen various, media briefings held by Ngizwe previously saying that this is nothing more but lies being peddled against him. He did not incite that violence according to these charges. But of course, we'll be heading back to Heidi Giokos for the very latest in this court matter.